Let's continue our discussion. Taras Zahorodny is joining us on air. Glad to see him, political technologist. Hello, Taras. Yes, we're glad to see you. Glad to see you. QR code on the screen. This is your opportunity to help the armed forces of Ukraine. Taras, here's my question. The phone conversation between Xi Jinping and Trump. That's what I want to talk to you about. All of this is in the context, again, of Zelensky's visit to the General Assembly. Were any issues discussed that might be of primary interest to us here and that affect the Russian-Ukrainian war? What is your assessment and what are the results of this conversation?
We don't know the results yet because there haven't been any action so far. We know that the US has now wrested TikTok from China. I think this was also recorded in the conversation with Beijing. In other words, the actions of this major network, which influences politics, are now subject to the jurisdiction of the United States of America. The servers are being moved to the territory of the United States of America. American owners are appearing there. So if before it was completely controlled by the Chinese, now it will be controlled by the US and companies connected to the US. Could they discuss anything else going forward? But theoretically, they could have discussed some possible trade agreements there. But I believe that this won't happen for now. I don't see any prerequisites for it yet because I think the US will mainly focus on India for now and only then return to China. They are indeed putting significant pressure on China from the side of the European Union, and we can clearly see that this pressure is so serious and substantial that the Chinese authorities are getting very anxious and concerned about it. For example, the land route through Russia and Belarus to the European Union has been blocked. The Poles, most likely in coordination with the US, blocked it on the grounds that it contradicts security. The hearings are over and the route remains closed. Then we see a sudden visit to Poland. The Chinese foreign minister recently went to Poland, but unfortunately achieved absolutely nothing of substance. In other words, the process of containing China is in full swing. It is being pushed out of every country wherever possible. The pressure on Europe from the US is unprecedented. Basically, the 19th package already provides for the possibility of introducing additional restrictions against China and India, as well as third countries that buy Russian oil and so on. So, judging by the way China is not being singled out, this process is not going as smoothly as the Americans would like, but the Europeans are moving in that direction.
Russia is once again striking civilians at a time when the whole world, and above all the US, is calling for peace. We have heard President Trump's position on stopping the killings and have agreed to all proposals to unblock diplomacy. But they hear this position, yet at the same time they don't hear this position, at least that's how it seems in Russia. Zelensky is talking about this. Tell me, please, does the public rhetoric of pointing out the problem of what is happening now in the Russian-Ukrainian war actually work? Or is it more for domestic consumption, as the Ukrainian president says, or is it still possible in this way to get through to the US administration?
No, it's for external consumption. It's a significant and considerable lever of immense pressure on the United States and, well, primarily and most importantly on the United States, because Ukraine is clearly demonstrating, first and foremost, it is reminding the United States that there should indeed be Zelensky's war, a conflict that is uniquely his own, and that's not happening. So this is additional pressure on the United States of America and a demonstration that, above all, Russia does not respect the United States of America. This is, well, a good diplomatic maneuver, I would say, on Ukraine's part, because I suspect that even the president understands that there won't be any meeting, but it's a convenient moment to put pressure on the United States and to show that, first and foremost, they are ignoring Trump's opinion, which is, well, a sensitive issue for the president of the United States himself.
Okay, let's talk about the ban on the import of liquefied natural gas and other types of gas, which is currently being presented in the European Union as part of the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. All of this is being positioned by experts as a significant blow to the Russian energy sector. Ursula von der Leyen reminded us that the Russian economy relies on revenues from energy resources. This is all clear and well understood. Tell me honestly, do you believe that the 19th package of sanctions will actually be effective, will actually have an impact? And most importantly, will Trump avoid mentioning that Europeans still need to give up petroleum products, which, As I understand it, they continue to buy from India and China, and which are still based on Russian oil.
He is putting pressure on the Europeans because they postponed it by a year. They were planning for 2027, I think, but they were forced to push that deadline back by a year. I don't think that will satisfy Trump either. He will demand that it be done faster because here the specific interest of the United States is to push Russia out of the European oil and gas market entirely. This has nothing to do with Ukraine. First and foremost, it's in the interest of the United States, which is actually very positive for us because it means the European oil and gas market is closing to Russia, probably for good. I think he will demand that the ban process be sped up, arguing that in 2022 the Europeans managed to sharply reduce imports of Russian gas in just 6 months. I remember that by the end of 2022, Germany had drastically cut back and stopped buying oil. Even though Nord Stream still existed, in reality it's even easier to give up liquefied natural gas, so I think the pressure will continue. There will also be pressure for the European Union to put pressure on China and India to establish a joint customs policy, which again is a concern for China and India, because Trump is clearly achieving significant successes, though not as much as he claims publicly. But Trump's negotiation tactic is always to ask for as much as possible and then see at what intermediate stage he can stop. But I believe they will push to eliminate Russian gas imports into the EU and possibly further to other countries, because at this point, interests diverge. For example, NATO countries and Turkey, which is still buying Russian oil. Furthermore, unlike the previous administration, Trump does not make any remarks to Ukraine regarding strikes on Russian territory or on the oil and gas sector. In other words, the strikes are happening and no one is saying anything to us, and so on. So, in this case, the process of strategically pushing Russia out of the European premium oil and gas market is underway, which for them is almost like a death sentence. As for other potential and additional measures that the European Union countries could still realistically take, they could, for instance, effectively ban the passage of these shadow fleet vessels through their sovereign territorial waters, but they have not yet done this so far, which regrettably allows Russia to continue its extensive exporting of crude oil through its various Baltic seaports virtually with complete impunity and without significant repercussions.
Here's what I'm reading in the latest news. The incursion took place over the Gulf of Finland, where Russian MiG-34 and MiG-31 fighter jets entered Estonian airspace without permission and remained there for about 12 to 13 minutes. This is what the Estonian authorities are reporting right now. In your opinion, was this incident accidental or is it a continued probing? Of course, from a political perspective, I'm interested in your answer. Is this Putin testing Europe's reaction following what happened in Poland?
Well, they've been doing this all the time. It's not something new. If you look at the pattern of these fighter jet incursions, they've been testing this constantly, probably for the last 10 years or so. But they really don't fly into Turkey anymore because Turkey shot down their planes. After that incident on Turkish territory, they don't fly there. So why don't the Europeans
shoot them down? Why don't they do the same as Turkey did?
Because that's just precisely the way it has always been. The European nations have consistently maintained this kind of rather passive stance. They have always, without fail, relied heavily upon the United States of America for their security. Now, the United States is explicitly telling them, you must build up your own formidable armies, and you need to take on significantly more of the financial costs yourselves, because the Americans are no longer willing to continue to support your security at their own considerable expense. Basically, these demands aren't new. They've been around for about 20 years. For example, the agreement with NATO countries to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP dates back to the 2000s. But they ignored all of this, which the US didn't like. The Americans kept reminding them, applying pressure in various ways. Even the Obama administration did this, but they did it too softly, so the Europeans just brushed them off. The issue became more pressing during Trump's first term, but they still tried to ignore it. Now they're going to pay the price for having ignored these demands. So why aren't they shooting? Well, that's the question. How are you planning to provide any kind of security guarantees to Ukraine if you can't even protect your own airspace? These are planes flying, but what if dozens of Shaheds a day start heading toward the Baltic countries or Poland? How are you going to respond to that? Will you shoot back in response? Many think otherwise, but the truth is that European countries have no answer because they always built their armies on the assumption that they would be an extension of the American military. Now that situation has changed.
The US ambassador named Whitaker stated that Trump will not impose peace terms on Ukraine and Russia. How should we interpret this statement? Is this something like Trump not doing anything at all, but how can you not impose peace terms, for example, on the aggressor? That basically means you are withdrawing from any actions altogether. And how do you assess this?
Well, there's nothing to assess. Look, let's go through the specifics. Weapons are being sold to Ukraine, right? They are. There is money for this, and there is. No one is giving Ukraine a hard time for striking oil terminals in the Baltic Sea, refineries, and so on, which did happen under the previous administration. For example, the SBU guys have already blown up that port in Primorsky. Was there any reaction from the US? Basically, there was none at all, because for the most part, they don't really care what happens with Russian oil. This is the fundamental difference between the Trump administration and the previous administration, which in principle needed Russian oil. That's why investment is promised. The military-industrial complex is promising. It's following the Danish model. It is. After experiencing pressure from Trump, the Europeans have become more independent, started spending more, which they had no intention of doing a year ago. So in principle, whether it works out or not doesn't matter at all, because whether something will be imposed or not is irrelevant. But they realize that the situation is much more complicated than they had assumed. So now they're trying to maneuver politically in order not to take responsibility for anything. Well, in principle, this approach suits us just fine for now. They provide intelligence, they sell weapons, weapons are being delivered, they are. What else is needed for effective national defense?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Well, I get that journalists are now trying to come up with something new and provocative, but they're writing that, contrary to all predictions, Putin is still managing to achieve victories in a long-term war. And here the question is not even so much about having seized Ukrainian territories, although for us that's important, but more about the overall hegemony of the US, which, as he has said many times, is truly coming to an end. The world order that was established after World War II is collapsing. As a result, NATO finds itself under threat, and its Security Council turns out to be incapable of ensuring peace throughout the world. Could you please tell us how you view this kind of strategic success of Putin as it is assessed in the West?
Well, did this just start today? It actually began back in 2009 when, during the Obama administration, in places where Biden was vice president, Russia was forgiven for what happened in Georgia. That was the legalization of aggression. And after Crimea, when they met with Putin, they effectively legalized the aggression. That's when the US began to withdraw under some far-fetched pretexts. Moreover, at that time, embargoes were also imposed on us regarding the supply of goods and military equipment. Ukraine, together with Europe, couldn't even import transmissions to make patrol vehicles. And, for example, they wouldn't sell us engines from combines, so we couldn't when the Europeans and the US together imposed embargoes on us. So this withdrawal actually started back then, and now the US is trying to assemble a new configuration where they will maintain leading positions. They are reassessing where they can and cannot maintain support right now. For example, they are moving away from the concept that whereas previously the US could fight two major wars, now they are shifting to the idea that the US can fight only one major war. There is an optimization and restructuring of the entire military structure underway. Their own military-industrial complex, which had been neglected for the past 15 years or so, is now being built up. And to say that this has just started now, that it's the end of hegemony and all that, no, that's not true. This began long before Trump ever appeared in the White House. And so, in this case, it's not really an objective view of reality. The fact is, Putin realized what he could get away with back in 2009 when they forgave him for Georgia and sent Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, with the reset button. We remember all these situations. You can see it all on the internet. Everything is there. Reset of what? So they attacked Georgia, were forgiven for it, and then people even came to apologize. So that's how Putin realized what he could get away with year after year.
Well, to wrap up, I want to ask you this. Now, the West is planning to invest $1 billion in the Ukrainian defense industry instead of providing security guarantees for Ukraine. In your opinion, does such a deal, from the perspective of the real world, suit us? If yes, then we should either specify some amount or sign some specific contracts. And in general, is it even worth going for this, or is it the only offer we'll get? And what is your assessment?
Well, look, the only real security guarantees for Ukraine are its own army and its own defense industry. So it's better to have your own defense industry and your own missiles rather than rely on someone else to protect you someday. Well, for example, I think that in Poland, the Baltic states, and Northern Europe, people don't really believe in the existence of NATO or in Article 5. That's why it's better to have something concrete. For this, Ukraine needs to open up its exports so that investments can be made, returns can be gained, and its own defense ecosystem can be built, one based on Ukrainian technologies and Ukrainian weapons. Only then will this be more or less a security guarantee. Here's an example regarding security and everything else. For example, in the Kaliningrad region during the Zapad exercises, Russia deployed Iskanders on the road right near the border. But on the border with Ukraine, they wouldn't do that because they know they'd get hit. So that's the situation. Therefore, at the moment, this is better than empty promises of someday joining NATO, which for many reasons may never actually happen. We are more interested in a format that allows us to maintain autonomy, especially regarding security issues. We need money to fund the Ukrainian army and Ukraine's defense industry. If you bring in soldiers, and those soldiers can't answer a direct question about whether they will shoot at Russians and fight alongside Ukrainians, then such soldiers are not needed here. What we need here are specific people who are ready to fight together with Ukrainians. By the way, they don't necessarily have to be EU citizens. Create foreign legions, following the example of what the French do. Recruit foreigners there, for example, from Latin America or Africa, pay them money. These will be energetic people who are capable of fighting. Yes, it is expensive, of course. But all of this is a matter of money, not all these stories about some mythical security guarantees that no one really understands how they would work.
Absolutely, yes. For example, when I hear about joint ventures being created where Ukrainian drone technologies will be developed, that sounds much more interesting and promising than some imaginary guarantees. Thank you very much. Taras Zahorodny, political technologist, was on air with us today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.